This is my second attempt at doing this. First time, totally messed up with the sound. The game sound wasn't balanced with my talking. Giving up on that. Gonna just mute the game to talk a little bit about the Diablo 4 patch notes. Step one is to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. Character screen, you can tell I'm one of the many people who did not find the post 50-ish grind intriguing. I've got a few low level characters, and you can see I did do druid on the the beta, so I've got very little bit of experience with druid, a little bit of experience, and a little bit of experience with rogue, necromancer, and sorcerer. Not a lot, but the point is that I want to put that out there so that we have an idea of where I'm coming from for the patch notes. Specifically, I don't want to get into this percent here, that percent there. I'm not going to be getting into the nitty gritty. I don't know the game math, and I don't really know the game all that well. The first thing I want to touch on, though, is we're going to get to what I think the biggest issue here is, which is I don't think that Blizzard's patch notes are going to solve the problems they have declared that there are. First of all, one little side note before we go right into things. Level scaling is getting its first tweak, and level scaling is good for playing with your friends, and that's about it. That's a super important thing, though, so I don't want to knock it too much. But I sort of see that they're going to keep tweaking level scaling over and over and over again. We see this whenever Blizzard wants to buff or nerf things. They do it one of two ways. They nibble around the edges where it's barely noticeable over and over and over through the entire existence of the game, or they just go in and they explode it and see what happens. Here it looks like they're doing the nibbling around the edges version of it. So I tongue in cheek will say that I don't know how much Diablo 4 Blizzard actually plays. So I'm going to get into this by talking about some of the bug fixes. Some of these are pretty hard to believe they never saw or figured out, like all of the dungeons that you just randomly couldn't finish. That's the majority of our end game content. I never got to the end game because I don't want to say burned out, but a lot of people have the complaints about the mid game to end game transition, and I am one of the victims of not making it to that end game transition. We'll see if season 1 is more interesting. So I've said before, not an optimizer or a theorist, so I don't want to try and come at it from that angle. And I also don't want to come at it from an angle where I'm saying the devs are just bad at their jobs. Maybe when we come to the end, you might take what I say and come to that conclusion. But I want to come across and say that I'm sympathetic. It is hard designing things. I have tried to design encounters for tabletop games, and even that way, you've got a much more controlled environment, really hard, and you can wing it at the table in ways that you can't with a computer game. So I am sympathetic to the position that the devs are in. However, the problem is that we'll go through a couple of the patch note fixes for each class to kind of get to. I don't think that the class fantasy is really being grasped, because I don't think they knew how these interactions were happening. We'll start with the druid. When you think druid, there's 3 types of druids, right? Shapeshifter druid, your caster, nature wizard, and then your friend of nature summoner type. When we go to our shapeshifter, we'll go my left to my right here. Shapeshifter druid. Rabies didn't work on melee enemies at times. Well, rabies, you bite people. So your shapeshifter druid fantasy just didn't work. Caster druid, sometimes your seeker tornadoes just didn't do damage. Just, a core part of your fantasy, null, void, doesn't work. Friend of nature, well, your AoE buff for your animal friends doesn't trigger on your ravens. Each one of the 3 archetypal druid fantasies inherently broken, and it took Blizzard through the preseason to fix them. I'm not as familiar with barbarians, as I said, but we look at it, we see Hammer of the Ancients. They're like, you're having too much fun with it. We're going to bring it down. Sorcerers will go through the same thing. Fire, which is, I play a fire sorcerer. Ice, electric, because I don't really know much about electric. Fire, your core enhancement, Firebolt, it just doesn't work with some of your other mechanics. I know that you rely on Firebolt for healing regen, some damage, triggering your stuff, maybe some reduction if I recall my skill trees right. So it's super important that you use Firebolt and you do it well. Except, it just doesn't work. The second, ice. Aspect of control is what makes your ice fantasy work because you get the boss staggered, you trigger all three of your things, and you get your big Nova. That's how Frost usually works. Except Blizzard is gonna. Here's where I think is the first point when I was reading through the notes where I thought Blizzard either just missed the ball or maybe wasn't playing straight with us because they say that aspect of control is a bug fix, but I think it worked exactly like they planned for it to work. They just didn't understand how that interaction was going to work with bosses being staggered. If you don't know, aspect of control. If a creature suffers from A, B, or C, then you get a damage buff. Two ways to read it, which is a simple or. Any one of these three conditions, you're good. Second way to read it, A, B, or C gives you D. So 1, 2, 3 can all give you an instance of D. I assume that was the way it was because that's the way it worked. I assume that at points Blizzard thought that's how it was supposed to work. They just forgot staggered counts all of the CC, making aspect of control super reliable and super good against bosses. Like I said, I haven't really done a lot with electric. I was going to be some sort of melee electric sorcerer, but sorcerers have only good defense if you're using their cooldowns, and you have to use their cooldowns. But then whatever. Point is, didn't really get into electric, but you look through the patch notes and all of their ranges are weird. Apparently, their crackling bolts could bug out near towns. So once again, all three of our class fantasies totally broken as a sorcerer. Necromancer, I looked at their bug fixes. I don't know Necromancer well enough to say. I do like that they're going to try and give us something other than Bone Spear. Maybe, again, I don't know the numbers, so correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe minions will be good. I'm going to be sort of a discount Paladin as my Necromancer with my Curse Auras and Bone Shield. So, here was a tangent that I went on, and I'm going to go on it again. In most times when you introduce someone to fantasy, you get one of three character types. 3 is a big number right now. You get me with a sword, me with a bow, me and I cast spells. Usually that me with a sword is me with a sword and shield, knight in shining armor type. Diablo 4 launched without one of the 3 core identities of a fantasy character. Very weird. Whatever. Let's get back on tangent. We've talked about the druids and the sorcerers that I know better than the other classes. Okay, let's get on to some things I think we can forgive Blizzard for. Perfectly fine that Blizzard didn't do these things right and give them a mulligan. You look at a lot of the bug fixes, and there are things like, hey, we didn't realize that if you added a point while this was active during combat, it didn't update properly. Now it does. That's forgivable. How often were you adding points mid-fight where if you gained a level, you didn't win that fight and the game would naturally take that moment of breather, reset everything, and you would never notice what you were missing. These are the sort of things that are reasonable to oversee and miss, as opposed to the entire foundation of various paths and builds. Now, mind you, all of those builds for the druids and sorcerers I talked about, they may not be the best builds, but they're ones that people like me, average nobody players who haven't had time to Well, we lie to ourselves as they say we haven't had time to go to max roll, but in reality, we're just stubborn and think we can figure it out. We make our own builds, we cobble them together, and I didn't even know that my firebolt enchantment wasn't working properly, or that when I had a druid that rabies just didn't work, or my casting stuff just wasn't being effective. That's pretty big, especially because my understanding is right now druids and sorcerers are kind of in the maybe the middle to bottom tier. Maybe druids are better than they were in beta. Again, I don't know. But these are some reasons why. So we've gone over all of that stuff. Another good thing, suppressor clones won't have suppressor anymore. I thought that's just kind of how they were clones. So I've never seen a suppressor clone that didn't also have suppressor. I just assumed that's how it worked, and it was just a bad day. Apparently not. So good for us in the future. Same with apparently enemy crowd control going to be less reliable on players. Speaking of crowd control, why is hamstring only going to slow healthy enemies now? This is an example of where I say I don't understand what Blizzard is trying to do. Hamstring, if anything, should be most effective on the enemies between healthy and injured and in the injured category so that they can't run away because you're a melee character who has engaged with them and you have gotten them to the point where they would want to escape, and hamstring is your like, hey, no, you don't get away. Apparently that's not how hamstring's supposed to work, and I don't like that change. But again, I haven't played a barbarian. Maybe you're not using hamstring to slow things that are weak. I don't know. Here's another thing that I don't know. Their developers note said something like crit damage and vulnerable damage are viewed as hard requirements for a build success. So we want more builds to flourish, and we'll continue to make changes to support that goal. Their current solution, so here's all of the other multipliers, crit, vulnerability, voo. And they're going to leave this down here. Just voo, voo. Now, you can't just buff. That's a misunderstanding of game balance. If everything's a 10 and one thing's a 5, you can't just make that 5 a 10 and call it balanced. You can, mattering how big the difference is. Just go with the analogy. You might be able to bring the two 10s down to a 7, the 5 up to a 7, so that gets you closer to balance. Right now, it just looks like all of your good damage multipliers are getting a pretty hard hit. Likewise, they don't like how easy crowd control enemies was to apply, so that also is getting a hit. Frozen, though, that's going up in how much damage against frozen enemies, so that's going up, which might be why barbarians are getting a unique that lets them freeze enemies, because you'll need to be freezing enemies to get more damage. I don't know. I don't understand any of those changes. They feel weird from a low to mid level player outside looking in. I'm sure people who know the game better will tell me why I'm wrong. All of this plays into one other thing that I wanted to just sort of spitball around. The designers have a problem with how the game is being played. They say that skillful players, let me see if I have this quote. There it is. Skillful players are frequently slaughtering monsters many levels above their own. And this is bad. This is bad because they don't want players skipping into world tiers too quickly. That's why they got rid of you being able to tag your friends up. And so now they're like, nope, we want to make it so that if you're a low level, you just can't clear the content because you're killing them too fast. So how do you fix this? Take a moment and think, if you're the Blizzard devs, players are killing things really quickly, really effectively at low levels. How do we stop that? Here's how they have decided to stop it. They're going to move power from defenses to offenses. Now, I'm not very good at the game. And so sometimes I get hit by AoEs. And I survive them on my sorcerer with barriers or an invuln. And I assume, I know barbarians have layers of shouts, druids have fortify, rogues I think have an invuln as well. But that's how you survive if you're bad. the incoming damage is generally so high. You get um, layered defenses, so damage reduction, barrier, high health, and then maybe an invuln. If you're good, you just don't get hit. Or you rely on your invuln. You don't have to, and you can rely on that enough, rarely enough, that you don't need as many other layers of defenses. What that means is that for the good players who are frequently slaughtering enemies above their level, you've let them punch even higher, and you haven't hurt them too much. I had an image here. Let me there it is. You probably can't read it, but go to the patch notes. All of this is damage going up, damage reduction going down. Skillful players are going to use this to their advantage to kill even higher level enemies, because if you are killing things while taking 0 damage, it doesn't matter how low your DR goes. You're still taking 0 damage. So I think this is going to be fine because, again, the good players, this just lets them get to the end faster, and bad players, we're going to need to layer their defenses anyway. So it just means that you can't be as bad as you were before. But I don't think it meets what Blizzard wants unless I misunderstood the patch notes, which it could be. So that brings me to the end of my quick analysis of the Diablo 4 patch notes. In bullet points, solving problems we should have already had solved, some forgivable fixes that, there's going to be bugs, whatever, fix them. A sign that the devs don't really have an understanding of the fantasy it feels of Diablo. They've got a really good feel for the atmosphere and all of that, but I don't know if they never played a druid who roared and for his ads, it feels like maybe they don't know how the game gets played. And finally, weird global damage changes that make no sense. So maybe you understand the game more and can explain it to me. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see how season 1 feels, but it doesn't. Let's call me lukewarm. Overall, like I said at the beginning, I'm one of those players who got to the post World Tier 3 stuff and just like ran out of steam. Just that the game loop just stopped being satisfying. Maybe season 1 will rekindle that. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, but let me know how wrong I am. And hopefully the audio comes out better this time. Bye.